It starts with a simple decision, a path chosen at random, a moment of freedom under an open sky. For most, it's just another hike, a chance to breathe, to escape the noise of everyday life. But for a few, the woods hold something else entirely, something you don't notice at first. It's the strange stillness between the trees, the way the shadows stretch just a little too far, the faint feeling that someone or something is watching. Imagine this. You're walking alone on a trail, the sun slipping behind the horizon. The woods around you grow darker with every step. You tell yourself it's just the night setting in, but then you hear it, a soft rustle, far too deliberate to be the wind. You stop. The sound stops. You move again, and it follows. And then there's the silence, a heavy, unnatural quiet that presses in, muting even the crunch of your own footsteps. It's the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. You look over your shoulder, but there's nothing there, at least nothing you can see. What if the path you chose wasn't just an escape? What if it led you straight into the unknown, into a place where the rules of the world you know no longer apply? A place where the forest is alive in ways you can't explain. Tonight, we tell the stories of 3 hikers who stepped into the woods and found themselves face to face with something unimaginable. These are their stories, true stories, and they will change the way you see the wilderness forever. Jenny and Chris were the kind of couple who thrived on adventure. Their latest idea for a romantic getaway was a hike deep into the Pine Hollow Forest, a remote and seldom visited wilderness. The trail was long, the trees towering, and the air thick with the scent of pine. As they set up camp on their first night, they laughed at the local legends. Some claimed the forest was alive, that it had a way of watching those who wandered too far. Chris joked about the idea, calling it nothing more than campfire nonsense. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to take on a life of its own. The first sign of trouble was subtle. In the morning, Jenny noticed her water bottle was missing. She assumed she'd misplaced it, but later that day, Chris found his compass gone as well. Shrugging it off, they continued their hike, laughing at their own carelessness. But then, the footprints appeared. As they returned to their campsite, they noticed tracks in the dirt, large prints deeper than their own and leading directly toward their tent. At first, Chris dismissed them as animal tracks, but Jenny wasn't convinced. They were too precise, too human-like. That night, things escalated. As they sat by the fire, Chris caught a glimpse of something or someone standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and still, its outline barely visible against the dark forest. He stood, shining his flashlight into the trees, but the figure was gone before the beam could reach it. Jenny grew increasingly uneasy. The feeling of being watched was undeniable now, the forest pressing in on them. As they lay in their tent, the sounds began. Faint laughter that seemed to drift on the wind, heavy breathing that grew louder as the night wore on, and sudden, loud snaps of branches nearby. Chris tried to reassure her, but his voice wavered, betraying his own fear. By the third night, the couple decided to leave early, packing up their gear in the dark. But the forest wasn't ready to let them go. As they walked, the laughter returned, this time surrounding them, echoing from every direction. Chris turned, shining his flashlight behind them, only to see the figure again, closer this time. Its shape was indistinct, but its presence was overwhelming. They broke into a run, the laughter morphing into guttural growls. The unseen stalker circled them, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps coming from all sides. In their panic, they stumbled into a clearing where they found something they couldn't have imagined. A hidden bunker, its door ajar. Inside, the air was cold and stale, the walls lined with faded photographs. Each photo showed hikers, smiling and carefree, standing on the very trails they'd just walked. But there was one thing they all had in common: the same shadowy figure lurking in the background. Jenny screamed as Chris turned to find the figure standing in the doorway. The flashlight flickered, plunging them into darkness. The last thing Jenny heard was Chris's voice shouting her name before the sound of the door slamming shut. When Jenny woke, she was lying on the edge of the forest, alone. Her clothes were torn, her hands scraped, but she was alive. Chris, however, was gone. Search teams combed the area for weeks, but there was no trace of him. Jenny's story was dismissed as the ramblings of a woman traumatized by the elements, but she knew the truth. A week later, a local news station aired a report. Another couple had gone missing on the same trail, their campsite found abandoned, their belongings scattered. The forest, it seemed, was still watching. The story continued with a man named Aaron, a seasoned hiker and nature blogger. He was no stranger to the wilderness, having conquered some of the most challenging trails in the country. But this time, his journey would take him to a place few dared to tread, the Black Hollow Trail. Nestled deep within the remote mountains, Black Hollow had an unsettling reputation. Some said the trail was cursed, the site of a tragic accident decades ago when a group of campers vanished without a trace. Others claimed to hear strange sounds when the wind swept through the valley at dusk, whispers that didn't belong to the living. To Aaron, the stories were nothing more than folklore, tales meant to keep people from exploring. With his camera in hand, he set out to prove there was nothing to fear. At first, the hike was like any other. The sun filtering through the trees, birds chirping overhead, and a soft breeze carrying the earthy scent of the forest. But as he ventured deeper, the air seemed to change. The trail grew eerily quiet, and the trees seemed taller, their branches closing in like a canopy. It started with something small. Carvings on the trees, crude symbols etched into the bark. They weren't initials or signs left by other hikers. They were unfamiliar, almost ritualistic. Aaron paused to photograph them, brushing it off as the work of a prankster. But then came the footprints. At first, he thought they were his own, the trail circling back on itself. But when he stopped to inspect them, he realized something chilling. They weren't leading away from him. They were heading toward him, one step at a time, disappearing as they drew closer. As he continued, the whispers began. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. They seemed to echo from every direction, carried by the wind that had grown unnaturally cold. He called out, his voice swallowed by the trees, and the whispers stopped, only to return louder, closer. Aaron's unease grew. The trail markers he'd been following were gone, replaced by overgrown brush. Every step felt heavier, the forest closing in around him, and then he saw it. A campsite hidden just off the trail. It looked abandoned, as if frozen in time. A tent sagging with age, a kettle still perched on the fire pit, and a backpack with its contents spilling out as though the owner had left in a hurry. Approaching the campsite, Aaron's camera captured every detail. He reached for the backpack, but as he lifted it, a shadow moved in the corner of his eye. He spun around, the hair on the back of his neck rising, but there was nothing there. Or so he thought. The shadow returned, darting between the trees. It didn't move like an animal or a person. It was erratic, unnatural, and then it was behind him. Aaron's camera dropped, recording the chaos, his panicked breaths, the crunch of leaves as he ran, and the distorted growl of something chasing him. The shadow figure stayed just out of sight, closing in with every step. Aaron ran until his lungs burned, until the trail seemed to stretch endlessly before him. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pursuit ended. He stumbled into a clearing, the figure gone, the forest silent once more. When Aaron finally made it back to the trailhead, he was shaken but alive. He told his story to anyone who would listen, but no one believed him. Locals insisted there was no such trail, no such campsite. And when Aaron checked his camera, the footage was there, blurry and chaotic, but unmistakable. The whispers, the growls, the shadow moving just beyond the lens. The next day, he returned with authorities, but the trail was gone. The path he had taken simply didn't exist anymore. Aaron stopped hiking after that, his blog left unfinished. But he always wondered, was he the only one who found that trail? Or were there others who never made it back to tell the story? Group of 4 friends, Mark, Emily, Sarah, and Jason, college classmates looking for an escape from the pressures of city life. Their destination, the dense, sprawling forests of Evergreen National Park, a place renowned for its beauty and its isolation. It was the perfect spot for a weekend camping trip. They laughed as they set up camp, their voices carrying over the crackling of the fire. The first night was uneventful, filled with ghost stories, marshmallows, and the occasional rustling of wildlife. But the forest held its secrets close, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It started on the second night. Mark noticed them first, distant lights flickering between the trees. At first, they thought it was campers from another site, but the lights were too erratic, moving too deliberately to belong to a flashlight or a lantern. As the night wore on, the lights grew closer, their glow casting strange, shifting shadows around the camp. The group huddled closer to the fire, their laughter replaced by uneasy silence. Then came the sounds. At first, they were faint, low, rhythmic hums carried on the wind. But as the lights approached, the sounds grew louder, accompanied by what they swore were footsteps. Jason, the bravest among them, decided to investigate, venturing into the woods alone. He returned 20 minutes later, pale and shaken. When they asked what he'd seen, he simply muttered, "Nothing," avoiding their eyes. That night, Jason barely spoke, sitting rigidly by the fire, staring into the woods. The next morning, things grew even stranger. Sarah found something carved into the side of her tent, symbols that none of them recognized. They brushed it off as a prank, but the unease lingered. Emily suggested leaving, but Mark insisted they stay, reasoning they had no proof of danger. That night would prove him wrong. As the group sat by the fire on their final night, the lights returned, brighter than ever, encircling the camp. The hums turned into an unearthly chorus, filling the air with vibrations that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. And then the whispers began, clear, deliberate, and close. Sarah froze as she felt breath on her neck, a voice murmuring her name. In a panic, the group packed up their belongings, desperate to leave. But no matter which direction they ran, the forest seemed to twist and shift around them, the path disappearing into darkness. The GPS failed, the compass spun wildly, and even the stars above seemed unfamiliar. The whispers grew louder, blending into distorted screams. Mark stumbled, his flashlight illuminating something in the distance, an indistinct figure watching from behind a tree, its face obscured. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing in the underbrush as the world around them fell into an oppressive silence. And then, nothing. When they opened their eyes, it was morning, and they were sitting at the edge of the forest, their campsite nowhere to be found. Park rangers found the group disoriented but unharmed. They had no memory of the last 12 hours, only vague impressions of light and sound. The rangers dismissed their story, claiming it was likely exhaustion and dehydration. But 2 days later, Sarah received a package in the mail. Inside was a journal, Jason's journal. None of them remembered him writing it, but the pages were filled with drawings of the symbols they'd seen on the tent, accompanied by entries written in his handwriting. The final entry read, "They're still watching. I don't think we ever left the woods." The group never spoke of the trip again, but to this day, none of them can explain the marks that appeared on their tents, or the whispers that still haunt their dreams. And if you ever hear strange sounds in the woods at night, ask yourself this: are you truly alone? 3 hikers, 3 tales, 1 common thread. The woods keep secrets no one is meant to uncover. Aaron, who found a trail that never existed. A group of friends, whose laughter faded into whispers and shadows. And Jenny, who escaped, but at a cost far greater than she could have imagined. Each of them stepped into the forest seeking adventure. But what they found was something far beyond their understanding. The woods don't just take. They remember, they watch, and sometimes they follow you home. And if you ever feel the call of the wilderness, ask yourself, is it truly adventure you seek? Or will you find something waiting for you? Something that was never meant to be found. The forest holds its own truths, but sometimes it's better not to know. Which story haunted you the most? Was it the vanishing trail, the watchers in the woods, or the silent stalker? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're brave enough for more chilling tales, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for more stories that will keep you awake at night.